everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the one and only Awakener podcast. This is a much different podcast than all the rest of them. And if you listen to this podcast, you'll understand right away why it is so different. If this is your first time listening, this might go woo right above your head. This might be too much for you. And it's going to be too much for the general population because the general population really is living their lives completely oblivious of what on earth is happening politically in our world. It's very simple. Like I've explained to you many times, and all the experts will say, oh my goodness, there is a hidden military-industrial complex between the USA and Israel. And I'll expand on that. Well, you're partly correct. There is. There definitely 100% is, but it expands obviously far beyond Israel to other Western nations as well. This complex that has been in control of this planet and has had the upper hand since 1945 is faced by a polar opposite conspiracy or industrial complex, I should say, that operates as a conspiracy that seeks to overthrow the US-backed complex and take power away from it. And once you see both sides, the yin and the yang, you can come to some conclusion of what is happening. You know what the Matrix is, ladies and gentlemen? The study of humanity is really the study of civilization wars that have happened throughout human history. And if you think for a second that you are not involved in a civilization war, boy, you have it completely wrong. It is not just one side that is seeking to control the entire world and all the resources and pass on its kind of agenda for all of humanity. There's two. And the winner of this war will dictate the future of all humanity. And I can tell you right now through observation of where this planet will go if the US industrial complex does not win this war. It's going to go into darkness. That is, the nations that oppose the US industrial complex are far more evil than the US and what it has done. And what they seek to do and their level of government is far worse than anything the US industrial complex could possibly raise up. This is basically, this US complex is at war with a communist conspiracy. And this is really a podcast detailing to you, and it can be repetitive in some ways, but it's detailing to you how this complex has been infiltrated by the communists. And this really goes back, once again, ladies and gentlemen, to Generation 5 warfare. Generation 5 warfare is basically taking control and destroying your enemy without even having a shot fired. Well, how do you do that? You convince your enemy you don't exist, and then you cheat and you lie and you infiltrate and you manipulate and control from within and cause their collapse. To explain it to you using world history, it's very, very simple. Go back to the 1970s, 1960s. In the 1970s and 60s, the United States of America did testing. They did testing on this submarine called the USS Narwhal. The USS Narwhal was revolutionary for one reason. They created a reactor that has no pump. There's no pump like whatsoever that will keep this reactor from melting. It's all operated under low speeds and can be run from convection cooling. This nuclear reactor was deadly silent. And as you know, with obviously nuclear missile submarines, the one kind of aspect that makes them detectable is their cooling pumps to stop the reactor from melting down. So obviously this was a giant discovery that the Soviets, the communists, did not have at the time. And when this was being introduced on the Ohio-class submarines that were rolling out in the late 1970s and early 80s, the Soviet Union knew they were destroyed. Why? Because if you go back 40 years, the Soviets knew that America, they weren't into this Palestine nonsense. Everybody knew that Palestine was a KGB Soviet creation, versus now, you can't convince the left of anything other. Everybody hated communists. Everybody hated Marxists here in the Western world in the 1980s. Because if you were a communist back then, you were considered an immoral person. The tragedies of communism were very open for everybody to see. The communists were killing Christians and Jews. They were killing their own citizens to raise their utopia. And there was so much utopia that was happening that poverty existed in such mass scales. And if you were a supporter of this, you were considered intellectually weak. You were considered a hypocrite, and you were considered downright crazy. Obviously, fast forward 40 years, and where are we right now? Well, the United States of America, half of us are communists and accept it. And you can't convince the left otherwise, even though if you see what's happening with Trump in Cuba, they'll all defend Cuba and all the societal failures that are going on there with people earning 20 pesos a day and 89% of Cubans being in poverty because, hey, the U.S. is horrible and the U.S. has done great evil. This is really, ladies and gentlemen, the battle that you're seeing unfolding. Now, where am I going to go with this podcast? And the reason I spoke about all this is really because if it's your first time listening, now it might make sense to you what I'm going to talk about next. And I'm going to talk about the government of Canada because the government of Canada is absolutely up to no good, and it's a giant travesty. And my fear is really Canada as a nation and the way that kind of I grew up and my parents grew up and enjoyed it is done with. And the reason it's done with is because Canadians voted themselves into communism in 2015. And this problem we have is not going to go away. The government of Canada is feeding the population a giant travesty of a lie. So 12 million people are being given a GST tax credit now to basically pay for groceries and food. And my question to everybody is, why on earth do we have 12 million Canadians that are so poor that actually need this tax credit? How does this make sense, and where have we gotten? And why is it that the same people continue to go out and vote for this left-wing Liberal Party? And the reason is, ladies and gentlemen, is because they've been educated to do so. They're demoralized. They don't know any better. The propaganda system that exists in the Western world is a giant system of government that has literally been run by the same guy who orchestrated the Iron Curtain collapse and faked it for the Soviets. And it's very easy to see once this person fed the Soviets, imperialistic capitalist propaganda in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, that all of a sudden he comes over in 1993 and buys out these organizations and starts his company in America, and then he infiltrates Canada, and now they control the Canadian government. And that's right, ladies and gentlemen, the guy that collapsed the Iron Curtain literally controls every aspect of the Canadian government, the decisions it makes, its policies in regards to obviously immigrants, its policies with vaccines, the whole works. And when you tell this to somebody, they come out with you with some like, oh, I have some news article that this and this and this, and they think, oh, this news article is going to prove that I am right and you are wrong, Matt. When it's not the case whatsoever. It's very easy to prove that news corporation that produced that article literally takes money from Open Society Foundations or works directly with him. And in fact, you can Google Trudeau and Soros meeting, and you can go very deep into detail about Trudeau's agenda. So what is Carney doing, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it's very simple. The answer is that George Soros and his groups are being kicked out of the United States of America because there is a covert RICO case against them, and these organizations are going to be removed from America because they lied to America that the Iron Curtain was over. It's that simple. So now that you know that, and you know what Trump is doing, which is undoing this Marxist agenda, and it's very obvious in plain sight that that's what he's doing. Once you understand that, you understand why Canada hates the guy, and Canada hates what's going on in the USA. It's because they don't want to be removed from power, because they are supposed to, or were on the verge of doing their giant communist revolution in utopia. Now, the government that was in control of us for quite some time was trying to lead us in stealth, obviously, to this giant Marxist takeover. But as you know, the Soviets, or Russia, Vlad, and Z, and Iran and crew were all kind of working together on a military operation to powerfully seize control from us if things went sideways. That is, to perform an actual revolution like they had in the Soviet Union with, I should say, a violent changeover of power. And as I've talked about many times, this relates to Iran and North Korea having EMP weapons in space, which I believe the general population of the world is about to find out that Iran's nuclear program is far more advanced. And there might be a giant war, ladies and gentlemen, which means you might have to fill your gas tanks up and keep them full. But the result of this war, and what I've speculated for quite some time on this podcast, is that our government here in the Western world is going to be directly implicated in this war, specifically with U.S. fissile material being in Iran's nuclear facility, and a bunch of other things that have happened in obviously previous administrations. And this has led really to Carney fabricating a whole giant lie against this dense Canadian population. And look what he's doing, ladies and gentlemen. Look at my previous shows. I explained to you that he's going to align himself with the European Union. I said this, a year ago? When he started his agenda, I said, listen, the first thing he's going to do is sign treaties, military treaties with the European Union. And the reason why this is going to happen is because they're putting up a plan, all of them, to stay in control after they're all implicated, after the truth comes out, after this giant war. And there is going to be a giant war. And why is that? Well, If George Soros and crew truly did actually work for the Russians and the communists, and if George Soros and crew actually did infiltrate us like I told you, and this giant plan to take over the Western world in stealth fails, this is really the closest that Russia and China and crew have been to making a dent in taking over this U.S. complex. And it's much like a giant bank robbery, ladies and gentlemen. The enemy is not going to go down and accept their defeat and going back to second place. They're not going to let their kind of system of government and their power kind of erode over the next 20 years and just become, you know what, we're very diminished compared to how close we are. No, they're absolutely going to go for it, ladies and gentlemen. They're going to do something stupid, which is going to take a large chunk out of this U.S. complex, which means if they can't destroy the U.S. complex, at least we can have all the oil, or we can have some kind of, all the minerals, and we can have at least the one up. So at least if the general population in the Western world knows the truth, it won't matter at least, because we'll have all the oil, all the power, all the money, and it won't matter anymore that the US and crew know the truth. And this is why I've speculated to you and told you the US knows all this. This is all just a giant war game where they are bringing out the truth because they know the truth is eventually going to lead to a giant war. And this is really what it's all about. Now, going back to Canada for one last time, Canada and obviously Carney, look what he's doing. All of a sudden, these people, this Canadian government that has basically, how do I say this? They don't take the U.S. seriously. They've never taken paying for national defense seriously. They've never taken NATO seriously. And they have old submarines that are basically useless, okay? We have old planes, not even Super Hornets. We have original Hornets, useless. And we have never really contributed anything of substance to NATO or the defense of the Western world. All of a sudden, we're interested in spending money on NATO, and we're interested in military. We're interested in arming our own citizens, leftists and liberals and females who obviously work in government, and training them in firearms, even though they hate firearms. And this is really only all happening because George Soros and his groups and these people, these globalist people, who are working with our enemies, are not going down without a fight. So the first fight is really going to be against Russia, China, and Iran, obviously. And the next fight is going to be against these people who are going to refuse to go away. Now, we've been in a kind of a lull for quite some time. I've told you on this podcast how, it's my belief, especially during Biden's time in office and what the communists were doing and setting up, it really seems like we're kind of in a lull where not too much is happening, where it's gotten kind of quiet past COVID, and a lot of people have gone back to thinking, well, nothing major is going to happen, and they're going to be on the eclipse of finding out, well, we were wrong. Listen, you're not going to take Greenland, you're not going to take Cuba, and you're not going to take Venezuela without something major happening. And before I let you go, ladies and gentlemen, everybody's still talking about the Epstein files, and it looks like the Democrats are so possessed with taking out Donald Trump that the only way they're going to basically remove him from office, maybe, is if they actually reveal all the evil themselves. And the Epstein files that we have, I will tell you this right now, this is just a giant drop in the bucket. And the population is really going to learn that not only is this a war against communism, where, obviously the Russians and their propaganda and their system has infiltrated us. This is not just against Iran and North Korea and crew that obviously have, EMP weapons in space. This is really a war about blackmail and who is controlled, and really the selling of their souls and who their allegiance is to. And all this will come out, ladies and gentlemen, like I told you. And the best part about this podcast is not just like listening to me here, it's go back and listen to my stories from a year or two ago. It's absolutely unbelievable. You could go back in this podcast 6 years ago and I told you that the USA would annex Canada. You can go back and I talked about Iran's nuclear program and the relationship with North Korea. I've talked about North Korea and Kim kind of being a mole for so long now. There's so many things that are awesome about this podcast that aren't necessarily going to be seen in obviously this show. So welcome. If this is your first show and this didn't go above your head, if it partly kind of hit, welcome. This is totally different than everybody out there. Anyways, thanks for listening, ladies and gentlemen. I just got back from the gym and I really just had to kind of vent about Canada and what they're doing. And I'm really, really sad for Canada and its future because, unfortunately, the Canada we love might not exist any longer in the capacity it is. Anyways, that's all for now. Take care.